The first thing people noticed about Nell Yardley's barn was that it didn't have a floor. Well, it did, technically, but where every other rancher in the Elkhorn Valley had packed dirt or rough-hewn planks under their livestock, Nell had a staircase. 8 steps, cut from split pine, leading down into the dark earth beneath the barn like she was inviting her cows into a root cellar. Folks passing on the road toward Cutter's Junction would slow their wagons and stare. A few even stopped to ask if she'd lost her mind. Stay with me, because what Nell built under that barn would change the way people survived winter in 3 territories. But first, you need to understand how a 26-year-old widow with 60 acres, a gray dog, and nothing but a dead man's debts came to dig herself underground in the summer of 1882. Nell had come west with her husband, Thomas, in the spring of 1880. They'd left Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, with a wagon, 2 draft horses, and a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Nell's grandmother, Oda Breitenstein, who had grown up in the Black Forest region of Germany before emigrating in 1839. Thomas had been a farrier's apprentice with strong arms and an easy laugh, and he'd heard about cheap land in Montana Territory from a pamphlet some railroad man had pressed into his hand outside a feed store. The pamphlet had not mentioned the wind. It hadn't mentioned the way the Elkhorn Valley sat like a trough between 2 mountain ranges, funneling Arctic air straight down its length from November to April. It hadn't mentioned that winter could arrive in October and refuse to leave until May, or how the thermometer could sink to 35 below and stay there for a week, or how the cold could kill a healthy calf in 4 hours if the barn wasn't tight. It hadn't mentioned the loneliness, the nearest neighbor a mile and a half away, the nearest town 7 miles of rutted track, the nearest railroad a full day's ride south. Thomas learned these things the hard way during their first winter, and he adapted the way most men in the valley did, banking snow against the walls, stuffing rags into every gap, burning wood at a rate that left the pile dangerously low by March. He built a lean-to for the cattle and packed it with straw, but the wind found every crack, and 2 of their 8 cows developed a cough that lasted until April. They ate salt pork and dried beans for 6 weeks straight because the root cellar had frozen through by January and turned their potatoes into stones. They survived, barely. Nell spent that winter reading her grandmother's journal by firelight while Thomas snored. Oda had written about the old farmsteads in the Schwarzwald, about houses built into hillsides where the livestock lived below and the family lived above, sharing heat through the floorboards. She'd written about earthen walls 3 feet thick, and about how the ground itself, below the frost line, held a steady warmth even when the air above was murderous. Nell had read these passages aloud to Thomas. He'd nodded politely and said that was fine for Germany, but Montana was a different animal. In August of 1881, Thomas was thrown from a horse he was shoeing for a rancher named Garrett Lund. He struck a fence post with the back of his head. He never woke up. Nell buried him on the hillside above the cabin where they could see the Elkhorn range, and she stood there for a long time with the wind pulling at her skirts and a half-starved gray dog pressing its nose against her hand. The dog had appeared 3 days after Thomas died, limping up the trail from nowhere, all ribs and matted fur and amber eyes that watched her without blinking. She called him Flint because that's what he looked like, gray and sharp and hard to break. For 2 weeks after the funeral, men came by the cabin to tell Nell what to do. Garrett Lund said he'd buy her acreage at a fair price. Jonas Merritt from the Mercantile in Cutter's Junction said she ought to go back to Pennsylvania where she had people. Frank Toller, who ranched the next parcel south, said he'd take her cattle off her hands before winter so they wouldn't starve. Every one of them spoke slowly, the way you'd talk to a child or a foreigner, and every one of them left with the same puzzled look when Nell thanked them and said she'd manage. She would not be going back to Pennsylvania. There was nothing there for her anymore. What there was 60 acres, 14 cattle, 2 horses, a cabin that leaked heat like a sieve, and her grandmother's journal. That September, while every other rancher in the valley was cutting hay and stacking firewood, Nell Yardley started digging. She chose the spot carefully. 40 yards uphill from the cabin, where the ground sloped enough to allow drainage but not so steep that the walls would want to cave. She'd studied her grandmother's drawings, cross-sections of the old Black Forest farmhouses with their heavy stone foundations sunk into the earth, livestock on the ground floor, family quarters above, the heat of the animals rising through the structure like a slow, living furnace. Nell didn't have stone. She didn't have a crew of builders or a century of tradition behind her. What she had was a shovel, a pickaxe, a strong back, and Flint watching from the edge of the excavation with his amber eyes catching the light. She dug for 3 weeks. The first 4 days were the hardest. The topsoil was laced with root and rock, and every shovelful felt like it had been nailed in place. Her hands blistered, burst, and blistered again before the calluses came in thick enough to hold. She worked from first light until the shadows grew long, breaking only to feed the cattle, haul water, and eat whatever she could manage standing up. Flint lay at the edge of the growing hole with his chin on his crossed paws, watching her with those amber eyes, as if he understood exactly what she was doing and approved. Down she went, 6 feet, then 7, then 8. The hole was 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, and the deeper she dug, the easier the clay became, cool and smooth and the color of rust, holding its shape when she cut it with the spade. By the time she hit the depth she wanted, the walls felt almost polished under her palm. The temperature down there, she noted in her own journal, was 42 degrees. Above ground, the September air was already dropping into the 30s at night. Underground, it was 42, steady, unwavering. Like the earth had its own slow heartbeat that no winter could touch. Frank Toller was the first to ride over and see what she was doing. "What in the name of God is that?" he said, leaning over in his saddle. "It's a barn," Nell said, not looking up from the trench she was squaring off. "That's a hole in the ground." "It'll be a barn when I'm finished." Frank pushed his hat back and looked at the excavation, then at the pile of clay beside it, then at Nell, who was 5'4" and covered in dirt up to her elbows. "Mrs. Yardley," he said, and his voice had that careful patience that made her jaw tighten. "You can't put cattle underground. They'll suffocate. They'll get sick. The damp alone. My grandmother kept cattle underground for 40 years in the Black Forest," Nell said. "They lived longer than any herd in the valley." Frank opened his mouth, closed it, tipped his hat, and rode away. By supper that evening, every rancher within 10 miles knew that the Yardley widow was digging a grave for her cattle. The jokes came quick after that. Garrett Lund told the men at the Mercantile that Nell was building a dungeon. Jonas Merritt wondered aloud if she planned to bury the cows standing up or lying down. A rancher named Holt Briggs, who Nell had never even spoken to, reportedly made a wager at the saloon in Cutter's Junction. $5 said the whole structure would flood or collapse before Christmas, and he had 3 takers. Even Pastor Aldrich, who was generally a kind man, mentioned in passing that grief could make people do peculiar things, and perhaps someone ought to check on the young widow. Nobody checked on her, or rather, they checked on her the way people check on a spectacle, riding past slowly, shaking their heads, offering opinions she hadn't asked for. Two women from the valley's small sewing circle brought her a pie and gentle suggestions about coming to town more often, as if what Nell needed was society rather than a shovel. Nell thanked them for the pie, which was good, and ignored the suggestion, which wasn't. She had no time for opinions. She was working. By October, she'd framed the underground space with timber posts and crossbeams, anchored deep into the clay walls. She'd cut drainage channels along the floor that ran to a sump pit at the low end, where water could collect and be bucketed out. She laid a floor of gravel over packed earth, 2 inches of creek stone that would let moisture drain through instead of pooling. Along the back wall, she built a feed trough from split logs, and above it she cut ventilation shafts, 3 of them, angled upward through the earth to the surface, capped with wooden covers she could open and close to control airflow. Then she built the barn above. This was the part that confused people most. The barn looked like any other barn: timber frame, plank walls, pitched roof with cedar shingles. But the floor was the ceiling of the space below, built from double-thick planks with a layer of straw packed between them. And in the center, where most barns had solid ground, Nell had the staircase, wide enough for a cow to walk down single file, gentle enough in its slope that even a stubborn heifer wouldn't balk. The whole structure was an argument with gravity and convention. The barn above would catch wind and snow like any building, but the space below, sunk into the earth and insulated by 8 feet of clay on every side, would hold warmth the way a stone holds the memory of the sun. She moved her 14 cattle down the stairs on the 1st of November. They went reluctantly, the way cattle go anywhere, but Flint positioned himself at the bottom of the steps with the quiet authority of a dog who understood work, and one by one, they descended. Nell had hung 2 lanterns from the ceiling beams. In their light, the underground stable looked almost cozy: warm clay walls, clean gravel floor, the sweet smell of fresh hay in the trough. Nell stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at her herd, standing calmly in a space that every rancher in the valley had called a grave. Flint climbed the steps and sat beside her, his breath making small clouds in the cold air above. "Let's see," she said, to no one in particular. Above the cattle barn, Nell built her cabin. This was the second part of her grandmother's wisdom, the part that made people think she'd gone completely around the bend. She dismantled the old cabin board by board, numbering each plank with charcoal so she could reassemble the walls without waste. She hauled the timber uphill on a wooden sledge pulled by her mare, a stocky bay named Ruth who had the temperament of a mule and the endurance of something older and wilder. Then she rebuilt the cabin directly on top of the barn so that the barn's roof was her cabin's floor. The structure rose from the hillside like a layer cake: earth, cattle, straw insulation, and living quarters, with the ventilation shafts running up through the walls like stone chimneys. Garrett Lund happened to ride past during the dismantling. He stopped his horse and watched Nell pulling nails from her own roof for a full minute before saying, "She's tearing down her house," to no one, since he was alone. He rode on, shaking his head, and by that evening, the valley knew that the Yardley widow was now homeless by choice. The principle was simple, though nobody in the Elkhorn Valley had seen it applied. 14 cattle produce heat. Not a little heat, a tremendous amount of it. Each cow generates roughly the warmth of a small stove, and 14 cows, enclosed in an insulated underground space, produced enough heat to warm the structure above them through the floor. The straw layer between the barn ceiling and the cabin floor regulated the transfer, enough warmth to take the killing edge off the cold, not so much that the cabin became a sweat lodge. Nell added her own refinements. She ran a clay pipe from the ventilation shaft nearest her hearth, so that the warm air rising from the cattle space was drawn across the cabin floor before venting outside. She packed the cabin walls with a double layer of sod and clay, 3 feet thick on the north side where the wind hit hardest. She built her hearth with a thermal mass of riverstone, a trick from her grandmother's journal, that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it slowly through the night. When she was finished, in the last week of November, the temperature outside was 9 degrees above zero. Inside Nell's cabin, without a fire burning, the floor was warm enough to walk on barefoot. 42 degrees rising from the earth and the cattle, filtered through straw and timber, held the cabin at a temperature that would have seemed miraculous if it hadn't been pure, stubborn physics. Frank Toller rode by on a day when the wind was cutting sideways across the valley at 20 miles an hour. He saw smoke rising lazily from Nell's chimney. Just a wisp, the kind of fire you'd burn in October, not the roaring blaze every other cabin needed to keep from freezing. He frowned, but said nothing. The winter of 1882 to 83 came in like a war. The first real storm hit on December 4th, dropping 2 feet of snow in 16 hours and driving the temperature to 22 below zero. The wind came after, piling drifts against barn doors and ripping shingles from roofs. Garrett Lund lost 6 cattle that first night. They'd panicked in his barn and broken through a wall into the storm. Jonas Merritt's store lost its front window, and by morning, the flour and salt on the shelves nearest the break were frozen solid. Nell's cattle stood 8 feet underground, chewing hay. The temperature in the underground stable, she recorded in her journal, was 39 degrees. Above them, in the cabin, the floor radiated a gentle warmth, and Nell burned half the wood she'd burned the previous winter. Flint lay on the warm floorboards with his chin on his paws and his amber eyes half closed, and the wind above them howled like something alive and furious. The cold deepened through December. On the 19th, the mercury hit 34 below zero, and Frank Toller lost his best milk cow. She'd frozen standing up in his barn, her legs locked, her eyes glazed with ice. He found her at dawn and stood there for a long time, staring at the dead animal and thinking about the warmth coming up through Nell Yardley's floor. His wife, Margaret, who had been less vocal in her criticism of Nell, but no less skeptical, said nothing when Frank came inside that morning. She simply poured his coffee and set it on the table and looked out the window toward the hillside where Nell's chimney released its thin, almost insulting wisp of smoke. By January, 4 families in the valley had lost livestock. The Merritts lost their draft horse, the animal that pulled their supply wagon to and from Cutter's Junction, which meant they were now dependent on neighbors who had their own problems. Holt Briggs, who had wagered $5 against Nell's barn, lost 8 head of cattle when the wind tore a section of his barn wall loose at 3 a.m. and the cold poured in like water. Old Pete Sayers, who had ranched the valley for 20 years and had opinions about everything, lost 11 head in a single week when his barn roof collapsed under the weight of snow that had no intention of melting. The valley was in crisis, hay running short, firewood dwindling, animals dying in barns that couldn't hold the cold at bay. Men who had laughed in September were grim-faced and quiet in January. Nell lost nothing. Her 14 cattle gained weight that winter. The underground stable stayed between 36 and 42 degrees, no matter what the air above was doing. She burned so little firewood that by February, she still had 3/4 of her woodpile standing. Her cabin was warm. Her animals were healthy. Her root cellar, which she'd built into the same hillside using the same principles, kept her potatoes and turnips from freezing. The neighbors noticed. They couldn't help noticing. Smoke that should have been pouring from her chimney was barely a thread. Cattle that should have been gaunt and suffering were coming up those stairs every afternoon, blinking in the pale winter sun, fat and calm. Nell herself looked better than anyone in the valley, rested, fed, unhurried. It was Frank Toller who broke first. He came to her door on a morning in late February when the temperature was 28 below, and his remaining cattle were huddled in his barn with frost on their backs. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and when Nell opened the door, a wave of warmth rolled out that made him step back. "Mrs. Yardley," he said. Then he stopped, worked his jaw, and started again. "Nell, I called you crazy." "You called me a few things," she said. "I did." He looked at his boots. "I was wrong, every word of it. I was dead wrong and too proud to see it." Nell studied him for a moment. The cold was making his eyes water, or maybe it wasn't the cold. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." She took him down the stairs. She showed him the cattle, warm and placid in their underground space, their breath rising in slow clouds that barely condensed because the air itself was warm enough. She showed him the drainage channels, the ventilation shafts, the gravel floor. She showed him her grandmother's journal with its careful drawings and measurements, and her own journal where she'd recorded temperatures twice daily since November. Frank Toller stood in that underground barn with tears running down his weathered face and said, "My God, it's warm as a house down here." "Warmer than most houses in this valley," Nell said. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, and there was something broken in his voice. Nell considered this. She could have said that she'd tried, that her grandmother's wisdom had been dismissed before she'd even finished explaining it. She could have said that nobody had asked, or that nobody had listened, or that sometimes people needed to see a thing with their own eyes before they could believe it. What she said was, "I'm telling you now." By March, Frank Toller was digging. He started his own underground stable on the south slope of his property, following the plans Nell drew for him on brown paper. He worked alongside his two sons, and Nell came by every few days to check the depth, the drainage angles, the placement of the ventilation shafts. She brought Flint, who sat at the edge of the excavation with the same patient watchfulness he'd shown at hers. Garrett Lund came next. He rode to Nell's ranch on a day when the snow was finally beginning to soften, stood in her underground barn for 10 minutes without speaking, and then said, "I owe you an apology, and I owe you a question. Will you teach me?" "Yes," Nell said, "to both." By the summer of 1883, 4 ranchers in the Elkhorn Valley were building underground stables. By the following summer, the number was 9. Nell taught each one individually, adjusting the plans for their specific terrain. Deeper drainage for the properties near the creek, wider ventilation for the barns that would hold larger herds, reinforced timbers for the plots where the clay was softer. She walked every site herself, pressing her hand against the excavated walls to test the clay, checking the angle of the drainage with a spirit level Thomas had left in his toolbox, measuring the depth with a knotted rope she'd marked in 1-foot increments. Some of the ranchers were clumsy at first. Garrett Lund dug his ventilation shafts too narrow, and Nell made him widen them by 2 inches on each side. Holt Briggs, the same Holt Briggs who had bet $5 against her, cut his drainage channels in the wrong direction, and Nell spent an afternoon helping him regrade the floor with the patience of someone who understood that learning a new thing was its own kind of digging. She never charged for the knowledge. When Jonas Merritt offered her payment, store credit, cash, whatever she wanted, she shook her head. "My grandmother gave this to me for free," she said. "She got it from her grandmother for free. Knowledge isn't like gold, Mr. Merritt. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger." Jonas wrote that down in his ledger below the day's receipts, and later repeated it so often that people started attributing it to the Bible. The winter of 1883 to 84 was worse than the one before. The mercury hit 41 below on the 6th of January, a temperature so extreme that spit froze before it hit the ground, and the nails in exposed wood contracted with sounds like gunshots. Trees in the high country split with cracks that echoed down the valley like rifle fire. The creek froze solid to a depth of 3 feet, and even the spring behind the Merritt property, which old-timers said had never frozen in living memory, slowed to a trickle and then stopped. 3 ranchers who hadn't built underground stables lost their entire herds. Holt Briggs, whose underground stable had been finished in September, walked down his stairs each morning into 39-degree air and fed cattle that didn't even know the world above was trying to end them. He told anyone who would listen that Nell Yardley had saved his livelihood, and the $5 bet he'd lost was the best money he'd ever spent. Old Pete Sayers, who had been too proud to ask Nell for help, stood in the ruins of his second collapsed barn and wept. The 4 ranchers who had followed Nell's plans lost nothing. Their cattle stood underground, warm and fed, while the world above tried to kill everything in it. Frank Toller's milk cow, a new one, bought to replace the one that had frozen, gave more milk that January than she had in October. The warmth, it turned out, wasn't just about survival. Animals that weren't spending every calorie fighting the cold had energy left over for living. Pete Sayers came to Nell's door in February. He was 71 years old and had ranched the Elkhorn Valley since before Montana was a territory. He'd called Nell foolish, reckless, and worse. He stood on her porch now with nothing left. No cattle, no barn, barely enough firewood to see him through March. "I'm too old to dig," he said quietly. "You're not too old to teach your grandsons," Nell replied. "I'll dig, you supervise." They broke ground on Pete Sayers' underground stable in April, when the frost had loosened its grip on the topsoil just enough to let a shovel in. Nell and Frank Toller and Garrett Lund and 6 other ranchers worked together, and they finished it in 3 weeks, a job that had taken Nell alone the better part of 2 months. Pete sat on a stump with Flint at his feet and directed the ventilation shaft placement with the authority of a man who'd spent 50 years watching which way the wind blew in that valley. His voice was hoarse and his hand shook when he pointed, but he knew things about that piece of ground that no one else did: where the water table sat in spring, which direction the clay shifted after a heavy rain, where the bedrock came close enough to the surface to anchor a post. When it was done, Pete walked slowly down the stairs, one hand on the timber railing Nell had insisted on for his sake, and stood in the cool underground space. He placed his hand flat against the clay wall and held it there. 42 degrees, Nell said from behind him. Every time? Every time. The earth doesn't change its mind. Pete Sayers nodded slowly. I spent 20 years fighting the cold, he said. You just went under it. 23 years later, in the autumn of 1906, a young writer from the Butte Miner newspaper rode into the Elkhorn Valley to write about what he'd been told was the most unusual ranching district in Montana. He found 31 underground stables spread across the valley and into 2 adjacent drainages. He found cattle that wintered better than any he'd seen in the territory. He found a community that hadn't lost a single animal to cold in 19 years. He found Nell Yardley, 49 years old now, her hair gray at the temples and her hands rough as saddle leather, sitting on the porch of a cabin that rose from the hillside above a barn that descended into it. At her feet lay a gray dog with amber eyes, the granddaughter of Flint, who had died peacefully in his sleep 7 years earlier on the warm floorboards he'd loved. The dog's name was Ember. Beside the porch, a hitching post held Ruth's granddaughter, a bay mare named Parcel, who had the same stocky build and the same stubborn patience. Mrs. Yardley, the writer said, they tell me you changed this valley. Nell looked out at the Elkhorn Range, where the first snow was already dusting the highest peaks like flour on a dark table. Below her, she could hear the soft sounds of cattle settling into the underground stable. Her herd was 32 now, and her neighbor's boy, a quiet 14-year-old named Samuel Toller, helped with the work in exchange for learning the methods. Frank Toller had insisted on the arrangement, saying his son needed to learn from the best, and Nell had agreed because teaching was the work she'd come to love most. The valley was always going to change, she said. I just dug in a different direction than most people expected. The writer asked her about her grandmother, about the journal, about the first winter, and the skeptics, and the years of teaching. Nell answered his questions the way she'd always answered questions, plainly without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. When he asked what she was proudest of, she was quiet for a long time. Ember shifted at her feet. A cool breeze came down off the mountains, carrying the smell of pine and the promise of winter. I'm proudest, she said slowly, that the knowledge didn't stop with me. That's the only thing I was ever really afraid of, that I'd know something worth knowing and it would die when I did. Everything else, the cold, the doubt, the digging, that was just work I could do. But knowledge that dies with one person, that's the real tragedy. The article ran in November of 1906 under the headline The Underground Valley, and by the following spring, Nell Yardley had received 43 letters from ranchers across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas asking for her plans. She answered every one, sitting at the table Thomas had built 26 years earlier, working by lamplight after the day's chores were done. She drew diagrams on brown paper and wrote careful instructions about clay composition and drainage angles and ventilation ratios, and she included notes about common mistakes. Shafts too narrow, drainage running the wrong way, timbers not anchored deep enough, because she'd seen every one of those mistakes made and corrected in her own valley. She mailed them with a note that said the same thing every time: pass it on. On a December evening that year, with the first real cold settling over the valley and the temperature beginning its long descent toward the numbers that used to mean death, Nell Yardley walked down the stairs into her underground barn. The cattle shifted and breathed around her. The air was warm, 42 degrees, as it had been for 24 years, as it would be for decades after she was gone. Ember followed her down the steps, nails clicking on the wood, and settled into the straw beside the nearest cow with a contented sigh. Nell placed her hand against the clay wall. It was warm, the way it had always been, the slow, patient, inexhaustible warmth of the earth itself. She stood there for a while, in the quiet, in the warmth, in the space she had built when nobody believed it could be built, and she was at peace.